So just a few things. First of all, this feast day, the Solemnity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Holy Family, is kind of a new phenomenon. The devotion was always there throughout the centuries of the church, but Pope Leo the 13th, back in the late 19th century, was very concerned about the family life, even back in the late 1800s. And then Pope Pius, in 1921, made this an official solemnity each and every year at this time of the year. And he was also very concerned about the rise of secularism and what that is doing to our families there. And so we've had this feast day ever since. And then, as you know, there's only two infancy accounts in the Gospels, the four Gospels. Luke fixates on Mary, and then Matthew, whose infancy account we hear about, he fixates more on the importance of Saint Joseph, although obviously both of them understand the importance of both the parents of Jesus. And there's a timeline that's a little bit hard to pinpoint directly. So obviously we got the incarnation of Mary, which happened in Nazareth, and then we got Joseph being told to go down to Bethlehem, and then Mary has the baby. And then that night there were angels, and then there were the shepherds there that night that saw the baby Jesus that very night. Now here's where it gets a little bit dicey on the exact timeline. We know that Herod the Great, the king of Israel, he was going to go after the baby, so there was a slaughtering. But obviously Joseph in a dream left before the slaughtering happened to Egypt. And then Joseph ended up going back after Herod died. Now, when all this took place, so here's the tricky part here. We know that King Herod died shortly after Jesus was born. And some people think it might have been as much as a week afterwards. And so that would go with the timeline. Most scholars believe that he died somewhere about 3 months after Jesus was born, which jives with the timeline. So Joseph was able to circumcise the boy and dedicate him to the temple, and then he got out of town. And then maybe Herod died within the 40-day period because Mary came back and dedicated herself with the purification thing. So we have all that timeline then. And then eventually they grew up. Jesus grew up, and Joseph led the family into Nazareth there. So we got that timeline there. And then I just want to remind you, Herod was an Edomite, and his wife, or his mother, converted to Judaism. So he wasn't a purebred Jew or a Hebrew person. But yet his daddy was able to finagle the Roman culture, the Roman politics, to where his daddy was the king of the Jews. And then he arranged it so that his son, Herod, was the king of the Jews. And Herod was a ruthless dude. He killed his wife. He killed some of his brothers and sisters. It was ruthless. And he even killed some of his sons. And to the point where Augustus, the Caesar, he made a comment, it's better to be Herod's enemies than one of his family members. And this is the paranoia that Herod had. And maybe rightly so, because maybe some of these family members were after him. Who knows? Herod was also a very great builder. He built two wonderful maritime ports along the Mediterranean Sea there in Israel. One of them we're very familiar with, Caesarea Philippi. He also redid the temple, and it was at par, maybe even surpassed the temple that Solomon built 950 years ago. And Herod expanded this temple there. He also built a great fortress city out in the middle of the desert with Masada there. And then I want to remind you of Saint Joseph here. Saint Joseph was a very, very important figure, but we have no recorded sayings from Saint Joseph. And so Joseph's, his witnessing came in his obedience. And think about the many things, the redirection that Saint Joseph had to have in being obedient to the husband of Mary and the father, the adoptive father, Jesus. He first of all, somehow his family ended up from Bethlehem in Judea, around that area, he ended up in the northern part of the Holy Lands. We don't know how he ended up there, but he did. And then the census happened where, before that, he was going to be engaged with Mary, and he married Mary. But in this process of marriage, for us, the marriage is, you come up here, you exchange your vows and rings, and it's done. But in the Jewish context, you have a party, but then the husband needs to build the house. And then once he builds a house, then he takes Mary into his home. And this was the process that Joseph was in. And then Joseph was told that Mary was with child, and Mary told him, or somebody told him. And then, in a dream again, Joseph said, it's okay to take Mary into your home. And then the dreams didn't stop there. Joseph's down in Bethlehem doing the census thing, and Mary has her baby, and then Joseph has another dream. And then when he's in Egypt, he has another dream, and then when he gets back to the southern part of the Holy Lands, he's got another dream, and so Joseph is filled with dreams. And this certainly highlights a tradition of Jacob, who had a dream, Israel. He had a dream of Jacob's ladder, and then Joseph, and then remember Jacob, or who changed his name to Israel, had 12 sons, and the second youngest son was named Joseph, and he had a whole lot of dreams. And he was able to interpret the dreams, and when he was sold by his brother into slavery, the Egyptians, he was able to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, which saved that whole area from famine. And so Joseph comes from a long tradition. Joseph, the adopted daddy of Jesus, from a long tradition of having dreams and God communicating in dreams. And Joseph is a wonderful example of how when you're obedient to God, our vocation, the word vocation comes from a voice. Our vocation from God is always going to take us places where we didn't expect to go. And I can speak that way for myself. And every married husband and wife, they're called to be married, and that's the reason why they decide to get married. And then that vocation, that voice, is going to call them to places where they had no idea they were going to go to. So that's one thing. And Joseph was a very wonderful example of being obedient, and that meant going to places where he had no idea and places where he really didn't want to go. And the last thing I want to offer you is this. As always, there's always the forces of evil working against family life. And so who heads the forces of evil but Satan? And Satan works through people and their paranoia and their shortcomings. And Satan was definitely working through King Herod. Even though we call him the Great, he was working through King Herod. King Herod did a lot of great things, and King Herod did a lot of evil things. And that's Satan working through him. And he was about promoting life, but he was also about destroying life, including the holy innocents. This is what Satan does. And I want to remind you about Satan, that Satan was good with God until God created humanity and made humanity on par with angels. And remember, Satan was an angel. Now he's a fallen angel. And that ticked off Satan to where he was rebellious. And then you guys know the story. There was a big cosmic battle in heaven, and of good and evil now. And Saint Michael, that guy right there, he threw Satan, all the demons out, all the fallen angels out of heaven. And now the battle of good and evil is in our world. And Satan hates human life. He hates the fact that God created human life, and especially that God created human life on par with angels. So Satan has been trying to attack humanity from the moment God created humans. And one of the key targets for Satan is the family. And this is where we got to realize that Satan is attacking families. And we see it definitely in today's age. When we try to do our part to uphold family life and fight against Satan, we got to know two things. One is that Satan is stronger and more cunning than we are combined. He and his demons are just more stronger and more cunning. So then that leads us to the second thing then. And the second thing is that we've got to turn to God all the more in our family life. It's very, very important. So as we honor the Holy Family, we actually turn to the Mary, Joseph, and Jesus for help of all our families. Our families are constantly attacked by Satan and his demons. That's the reality. The reality is that battle of good and evil is now spilled out in our world and directed at our families. And so we pray that all our men out there, that they're like St. Joseph, that they're going to do anything they can to protect their families from evil. Any kind of evil, however shape and form it comes. And they can't do that by themselves. Satan is too strong and too cunning for them. And so husbands and wives have to turn to God constantly, and that's why the Eucharist is so important. And that's why praying daily rosaries and turning to the Holy Family on a regular basis and asking the Holy Family to protect all our families, that were created for God. And like Joseph, that the child Jesus wasn't actually his, it belonged to God. And parents, your children that you have, they don't really belong to you. You are stewards, they belong to God. And certainly at baptism, that highlights that. So let's continue to pray in thanksgiving for the wonderful witness and graces of our Holy Family. And pray for families everywhere as they battle the evils of Satan and try to live their lives for the glory and grandeur of the kingdom of heaven.